Hi, I'm Gabe from Unsolicited Designs, and welcome to Recycled Ideas, a series where I look back on card cycles from throughout Magic's history, evaluate their designs, and propose new versions that have more thematic cohesion and are more in line with modern design principles. In this episode, I'm going to complete my review of the Ascendancy cycle. If you haven't already, check out the previous episode where I analyzed the wedge designs of these enchantments. The second half of this cycle was completed with the release of Streets of New Capenna in 2022. They're a combination of one color and its two aligned colors, as depicted on the back of every single-faced Magic card. These color groupings are typically referred to as Shards, from their introduction in the 2008 set, Shards of Alara. However, because this portion of the cycle is based on the identities of the crime families from New Capenna, I'll be referring to the mechanics and flavor of that set for my critique and redesigns. So to start off, let's get an overview of what these cards have in common and where they differ. First off, the similarities. They're all rare, enchantments, have a mana value of 3, and each of them have a cost of 1 colored mana for each color of its family's identity. We know these families as the Brokers, Cabaretti, Maestro, Obscura, and Riveteers. Other commonalities include they all relate to creatures in some way, but don't really enhance them in the same ways the first half of the cycle did. And they all tie somewhat loosely into family mechanics. Looking at the differences, they provide 1 or 2 bonuses, but more often than not, it's just 1. And across all 5 cards, there are 2 passive bonuses and 4 triggered abilities. This group of 5 cards from the cycle are all far more uniform than the group from Khans of Tarkir, which featured an Enter the Battlefield trigger and the ability to sacrifice the Ascendancy itself. My evaluations and redesigned versions of these cards will focus on unifying them in the following ways. In power level of the cards across the cycle, ensuring they play closely with the family's mechanics, and having a consistent offering of 1 passive and 1 triggered ability, with the passive ability focused on affecting creatures. With those criteria in mind, let's get started. First up, the Lawyer family. Broker's Ascendancy costs 1 green, 1 white, and 1 blue, and you get an enchantment that says, at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and a loyalty counter on each planeswalker you control. We're starting off strong. This is a great effect that, on any given turn, doesn't amount to much, but over time adds up to a dominating advantage. I really like that they included the addition of loyalty counters. I think that gives this card some added power and increases its range of appeal. Personally, I think this card is great and could be left totally unchanged, but for the sake of this exercise, I have my own version to present you with. My custom version reads, creatures you control have, remove a counter from this creature and tap it, add 1 mana of any color. Activate only any time you can cast a sorcery. And, at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control and a loyalty counter on each planeswalker you control. My version retains the ability of the printed card exactly. The difference is, as part of my design goals for the cycle, it now passively grants an ability to all your creatures. I took inspiration from the Broker family head, Falco Spara. Your creatures gain the powerful utility of being able to add mana, but it requires removing a counter from themselves to do so. I also chose to limit the activation of this ability to sorcery speed only. As I said, I think this card is pretty strong as is, so adding a new ability onto it definitely required some restrictions. The Brokers have a focus on the shield counter mechanic, so my design allows you to remove a counter of any type to add mana, whether that be a shield or other ability counter, or simply one of the +1/+1 counters the Ascendancy provides. I agree that my iteration of Broker's Ascendancy pushes the envelope, perhaps a bit too far, but it does do a good job of meeting my design goals and expands the card in a desirable way, while also including some prudent limitations. Just how a Broker's lawyer would draw it up, don't you think? Next up are the party goers of the plane. For 1 red, 1 green, and 1 white, you get Cabaretti Ascendancy, an enchantment that says, at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature or planeswalker card, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. If you don't put that card into your hand, you may put it on the bottom of your library. Looks like the hangover hit this Ascendancy harder than an Irish wedding. Of all the cards in this Shard cycle, I'd say this design is by far the worst. Provided that your deck is running a combination of 40% lands and mana ramp spells, and the rest is entirely creatures and planeswalkers, this card amounts to draw a card 60% of the time. I think it would be quite difficult and dangerous deck construction to get that up to even a 66% success rate. And at a price of 3 differently colored mana, that's a laughable return. Worse still is that if you do get to put the card into your hand, you have to reveal it to your opponents. One last upside here is that if you don't draw the top card, you can choose to put it on the bottom of your library instead. This can help you bypass dead lands in an attempt to find something useful, but in these colors, I feel like the text Scry 1 would have been perfectly acceptable, and probably far better at that. All of this, and I haven't even mentioned how this design has almost nothing to do with the Cabaretti. The main mechanic of the Cabaretti is Alliance. That is, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you trigger an ability. Looking at this example at Uncommon, Cabaretti Ascendancy looks even more uninspired. So with all of that in mind, let's take a look at my concept. As long as it's your turn, creatures you control have hexproof and cannot be blocked by more than one creature. Whenever you attack with one or more creatures, exile up to one target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. My version of the card plays into the Alliance mechanic by allowing you to flicker a creature. The trigger is dependent on you attacking, so it does encourage you to be aggressive and proactive, but it also could affect your sequencing. Typically you want to cast spells after combat so as to give your opponent less information. My version of the Ascendancy incentivizes you to cast creature spells before combat so you can take advantage of the trigger multiple times. Keep in mind that my version doesn't force you to throw away creatures in combat to get the benefit. You can attack with just one creature to trigger the effect and then blink it safely out of combat. The passive ability of my custom version also plays into protecting your alliances by granting your creatures hexproof during your turn. That way, your synergies will be difficult to disturb. It also makes it so your attackers can't be bullied by multiple blockers. This gives them added survivability and allows you to press the attack. One last interaction I really like with my design is that you can take it one step further. If you can include multiple combat steps, you can reap the benefit of multiple blink triggers. So my version of Cabaretti Ascendancy plays into the faction's identity, provides a more powerful and interesting effect, and enables a wider range of deck building rewards. I'd say the original version of this card is the equivalent of a seedy dive bar, but my iteration is the soulful soiree this family embodies. That brings us to the Artistic Assassins, the Maestro. For 1 blue, 1 black, and 1 red, you get Maestros Ascendancy, an enchantment that says, once during each of your turns, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from your graveyard by sacrificing a creature in addition to paying its other costs. If a spell cast this way will be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. This is the only card in the cycle that gives you the ability to simply just take an action at some point during your turn. The Maestro family mechanic is Casualty, and while the Ascendancy is potentially quite powerful, it only mimics Casualty, since you sacrifice a creature as part of recasting an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. But you don't get a copy of the spell like you would if you were paying the casualty cost. Yes, the printed version does pair nicely with the mechanic, since you'd essentially get 4 copies of any casualty cards you cast, but the fact that you have to sacrifice another creature on top of the casualty cost just doesn't sit right with me. So here's my vision for Maestro's Ascendancy. Creatures you control get +1/+0. Once during each of your turns, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from your graveyard by paying 3 life in addition to paying its other costs, and it gains Casualty 2. If a spell cast this way will be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. I've personally attempted to use Casualty in some of my decks, and like many players I'm sure, I was drawn to using token creatures as sacrifice. Since the most attractive options had casualty costs of at least 2, it meant I was limited to creature tokens with 2 or greater power. So by adding the +1/+0 bonus, it expands the number of creatures available to pay the price. I think this is a rather elegant solution that pairs perfectly with the family mechanic. And is aggressively slanted, so it doesn't intrude on Anthem design space. As any true artist can attest to, sometimes you need to suffer for the sake of your work, and my version of Maestro's Ascendancy asks you to do just that by paying 3 life each time you want to flash back an instant or sorcery. This criteria helps alleviate some of the dissonance of needing to sacrifice a creature so that you can sacrifice a creature. The life loss also helps counterbalance the card, since I've added the clause that grants Casualty 2 to the spells you cast with Maestro's Ascendancy. I think the printed version of this card is fine, but mine is far more enticing. It offers you greater power, but at a greater price, not only asking the sacrifice of your minions, but of yourself as well. And hopefully at the very least, my take on Maestro's Ascendancy, like all great art, will make you have to really stop to take it all in. Here we have the family of mystics, magicians, prophecy, and, as their enchantment heavily emphasizes, communing with spirits. For 1 white, 1 blue, and 1 black, you get Obscura Ascendancy, an enchantment that says, whenever you cast a spell, if its mana value is equal to 1 plus the number of soul counters on Obscura Ascendancy, put a soul counter on Obscura Ascendancy. Then create a 2/2 white spirit creature token with flying. as long as there are 5 or more soul counters on Obscura Ascendancy, spirits you control get +3/+3. Interestingly, this is the one card in the 5 family cycle that meets my goal of having 1 passive ability and 1 triggered ability. And I hate it. Okay, maybe hate is a strong word, but what is going on here? The Obscura utilized the connive mechanic, and this card clearly has nothing to do with that. Furthermore, I don't think there's a single Obscura card that makes or even cares about tokens. In fact, Body Launderer, which has the Obscura watermark, specifically omits token creatures from its text. Though there are Mage's Attendant and Misfortune Teller, which fit the Obscura concept at the very least. So this card is more or less completely untethered from the family mechanics, and is riding entirely on flavor. While I can appreciate that it is unique among the cycle, I think there are some major issues with its design. This concept has appeared before, and I've even included these types of cards in my decks at one point. They require you to cast spells of an exact mana value in an exact sequence, and while the rewards are pretty nice, you have to totally skew your deck construction for this effect. And you're only going to get a finite number of tokens, unless you further skew your deck to include an excessive amount of X spells. And those are generally mana inefficient until you can cast them at values of X being 4 or more. While it is tempting to fiddle with this concept, it really wouldn't meet my design goals for this cycle, so I have a completely reworked version to show you. It says, creatures you control with counters on them have flying, and whenever you discard 1 or more cards, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. My idea for Obscura Ascendancy plays into the family mechanic in 2 ways. First, the passive ability grants flying to creatures you control with counters on them, which conniving will accomplish. Secondly, whenever you discard 1 or more cards, you get to put a counter on your creatures, which conniving will accomplish. Better still is that my iteration can be effective even if your deck doesn't connive at all. There are plenty of options for discarding cards, and doing so will let you add a +1/+1 counter to a creature you control and let it take flight. So my design for Obscura Ascendancy plays directly into the family's core mechanic of connive. I really like that it'll let you add a counter to a creature you control when you connive, no matter what type of card you discard. And if you can discard a non-land card, you wind up with double the counters instead. My version of Obscura Ascendancy loses the soulful design of the printed version, but better embodies the spirit of the family. Which version do you prefer? And lastly, we have the reckless, wrecking crew construction family, the Riveteers. For 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green, Riveteers Ascendancy is an enchantment that says, whenever you sacrifice a creature, you may return target creature card with lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Do this only once each turn. This is a reasonably powerful effect, and I don't think it requires any major changes like the Cabaretti and Obscura did. This card does a great job of interacting with the Riveteer mechanic, Blitz, which is an alternate cost to cast a creature spell. The creature gains both haste, and when it dies, you draw a card. You must sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. To meet my goals, all this card really needs is a passive ability, so here's what I've come up with. Creatures you control with haste have double strike. Whenever you sacrifice a creature, you may return target creature with lesser mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Do this only once each turn. Aside from the passive bonus, the rest of this card is identical to the printed version. I decided to just play closer to the family mechanic by giving your blitz creatures double strike. This really encourages you to ratchet up your riveteering by making your creatures twice as dangerous. And beyond just synergizing with Riveteer identity, it also plays terrifically with haste creatures in general, which red, green, and black are the core colors for. So a rather simple modification for this last Ascendancy, but I think it's an addition that fits perfectly into the Riveteer toolbox. Do you agree? And there you have it, my recycled versions of the Ascendancy enchantments from the streets of New Capenna. Did I meet my goals of making them more unified in design, power level, and a better complement to their faction-centric mechanics? I'm curious to hear what you think, and let me know if there are any other interesting cycles you want me to revisit for this series. Thanks so much for watching. I hope I earned a like and subscribe from you, and I'd love it if you'd share this video. If not, thanks for listening this long anyways. You can follow me on X at UnsolicitedMTG for channel updates and more nonsense. Once again, I'm Gabe from Unsolicited Designs and Who Asked Me Anyways?